Hello and welcome to another lecture from my class, PSYC 770, Psychological Testing and Assessment. And we're beginning again with a great comic from the great webcomic series PhDcomics.com. This one doesn't have as much of a direct connection with the topic for today's lecture as some of the previous ones have, but it's still fun, and I think it conveys a sentiment that probably many graduate students can appreciate. Anyway, so today's topic is going to be ethical guidelines for psychological testing. Now, in the previous lecture, I talked in somewhat more general terms about ethical and social implications of psychological testing, and I hope you found that interesting. I did. In today's lecture, I want to get a little bit more specific and talk about some of the principles and some of the guidelines that apply to psychological testing and assessment. So by way of an overview, I'm going to start by talking a little bit about some historical examples of unethical research. Then I'm going to talk a little bit about the Belmont Report, and then really spend most of the lecture talking about guidelines for psychologists, ethical guidelines that is, and especially those that apply to testing and assessment. So first off, some unethical research. A classic picture here from one of Stanley Milgram's obedience experiments. Now, right off the bat, you might be thinking, wait, why are we covering research? I teach other classes on research methods and statistics. This is a class on testing and assessment, so why am I talking about research in this class? Well, of course, all research uses testing in some form. I mean, if you're measuring anything, you're using some sort of a test. So I don't think it's entirely irrelevant to talk about psychological research in a class on testing and assessment. I'm also talking a little bit about research because it provides a good way to begin talking about ethical guidelines which govern testing and assessment. And these come to us historically by way of the Belmont Report, which I'll get to, and probably which some of you are already familiar with, and also from the APA's guidelines, which are largely based off of the Belmont Report. And of course, I will cover testing, so I'm going to spend a fair amount of time in this lecture talking a little bit, or more than a little bit, about the specific ethical principles and guidelines for testing. Okay, that's cool. Let's go on and talk about some unethical research. Now, one of the most famous, really infamous examples of unethical research is or was conducted by the U.S. Public Health Service at the Tuskegee Institute from the early 1930s to the early 1970s. This study was a longitudinal examination of African American men, some of whom were infected with syphilis and some of whom were not. And the study looked at a variety of outcomes for these different groups. Now, what's concerning from an ethical standpoint about this study are a number of violations of basic, what we would now consider to be basic good principles of ethical research. For instance, there was harm done to participants in the sense that some participants in the study, those infected with syphilis, were not given treatments which would have been effective at managing their symptoms or even removing their infection. Related to this idea of harm to the participants was a kind of a lack of respect. Important health information was withheld from participants, and that shows a disregard for their choices and their interests that they might have had about their own health and about their own lives. And especially troubling, I think, about this example is the fact that it involved a historically and currently disadvantaged group. African American or black people have suffered a great deal historically in our country because of prejudice, because of economic disadvantage, limited access to education, racism, all sorts of really horrible things which have gone on historically and in many ways still go on today. Thus, African Americans are a disadvantaged group. It's not particularly controversial to say that, I hope. And targeting this group for research, as opposed to, for instance, sampling broadly across the population of all Americans to include a variety of different folks from different levels of economic advantage or disadvantage, that's problematic in this study. So, this I strongly encourage you to read up a little bit on the history of the Tuskegee experiment. It's a really fascinating and rather sad in many ways story. I'll post some information on the Blackboard site for this class, and I'll try to link in YouTube to some interesting videos on this. But for the time being, the important point here is that this is an example historically of research that involved some violations of what we now consider to be good ethical principles. Another kind of famous example, and I've already kind of previewed this a little bit, is some of the obedience experiments done by Stanley Milgram in the early 1960s. These are the studies that you almost certainly remember from your introductory psychology class or your kind of introductory research methods in psychology class, where participants were brought into a laboratory. They were supposedly randomly assigned to be either a teacher or a student in a kind of a dyadic interaction. The participants were always assigned to the teacher role, and the person assigned to a student role was actually a Confederate. The person in the teacher role, the real participant in the study, was then given the instruction to administer an increasing levels of apparent electrical shock to the student as he or she failed to make a series of correct decisions on a series of problems. So again, you're familiar with these experiments, and there actually were quite a few experiments. It's not just one experiment. You're familiar with them from your classes, and you're probably familiar with some of the ethical problems that came up or have been cited in connection with these studies. Certainly at the time, there were some acute effects on participants. Most participants in the study, again, people who thought they were administering severe electric shocks to a supposedly innocent person, felt extremely upset or distressed by this. So people at the time they were in the study felt really upset, and that's problematic from an ethical standpoint, because really we have the idea that we ought not to cause harm to folks when we're conducting research, or for that matter when we're doing testing. If at all possible, we should avoid causing harm. There are also some concerns about the chronic effects of being in this study. There was inconsistent use of debriefing following the study, so some people who participated in the study were given a fairly thorough talking to afterwards to explain what the study was about and what was really going on. There wasn't actually electricity being administered to someone, and that other person wasn't really just another innocent participant. He or she was actually a Confederate working as part of the study, and so on. But other people in the experiments weren't given that level of detail. Milgram claimed at the time that he published results of this of his studies, and has claimed in the years following, that most participants who participated in these experiments reported feeling a benefit from their experience. Although they were distressed at the time, they subsequently felt like they learned something valuable about themselves or about human nature more generally, and that they saw this experience as largely positive or beneficial to them. However, in relatively recent years, some historians have disputed this claim. And by at the risk of turning this into book club again and making book suggestions, I highly recommend a book that I recently read, Behind the Shock Machine: The Untold Story of the Notorious Milgram Psychology Experiments by Gina Perry. She's a kind of science journalist, and basically what she does is explore some of the laboratory notes and historical records of these experiments. She conducts interviews with some of the surviving participants of this experiment, and comes away with the impression, which she relates to the reader, that the story that we've been told about the Milgram experiments is far more complicated than we think it is. For instance, not all the participants who were in the study reported positive outcomes. Many people felt scared or concerned or distressed for a long time afterwards. Also importantly, the results of the study, which is, as you probably remember from your psychology classes, that the majority of people, 60% in most experiments, administered the maximum maximum shock under instruction, those results are not nearly so clean as we might imagine. And in many versions of the experiment, few people administered high levels of electric shock. So it's a complicated, fascinating story. Like so many things in science, you begin to scratch away at the details and you see that the picture you got or the story you were told in your intro level class is more complicated, and probably that's a good thing. Anyway, great book, quick read, highly recommended, about Milgram. So perhaps one of the real important points here is the idea of an ethical balance that needs to be found in research, and as we'll see a little bit later in this lecture, needs to be found in testing as well, between the risks that the research or the testing poses to the participants, things like acute distress, or chronic distress, and so on, and balance that against the benefits that might accrue to science, to the public, to the researchers or clinicians themselves, things like increases in basic knowledge, interesting applications, and so on. So again, a couple historical examples here that highlight some of the ethical problems that arise in research, and that, as we'll see a little bit later on, are also applicable to testing. I mentioned the Belmont Report earlier. This is something you may be familiar with from other classes, perhaps especially if you've taken a research methods class. The Belmont Report was commissioned by Congress in 1976 in part because of concerns over unethical research, particularly the Tuskegee study, but also other studies as well that were occurring in medicine and elsewhere, concerns about the ethics around research. It was a commission that involved a group of clinicians, researchers, ethicists, and after deliberation, they set out principles for human subjects research. These principles are summarized in a report and really have three main components. 1, respect for persons, 2, beneficence, and 3, justice. Now this report is the basis for many sets of ethical principles in other fields, including psychology. And as we'll see in a couple more slides, the ethical principles that the American Psychological Association promotes are built largely off of those in the Belmont Report. Also interesting and important is that the Belmont Report is a model for institutional ethics policies. So if you conduct research, or for that matter, if you do testing at a university or at a hospital or at a public clinic, basically any institution that receives federal funding must by law have an ethical review committee or ethical review board, and many of them base their principles that they use when deciding whether to approve or not approve research or whether to approve or not approve testing. They base those on elements of the Belmont Report. So let's take each of the elements in the Belmont Report individually and talk a little bit about them. The first of these is respect for persons. Respect for persons has kind of two main provisions. The first is that people are treated as autonomous agents. They're allowed to make their own decisions based on what they feel is best for themselves. An important sort of corollaries or implications of this provision is that people should be given informed consent about research that they are being offered participation in or testing that they're being offered, and that they shouldn't be coerced or kind of overly persuaded or certainly not forced to participate in research or participate in testing that they don't want to participate in. A related idea, or a second main provision, I guess I should say, from our first principle, respect for persons, is that some people deserve special protection. Those people who can't give consent, people who can't give the type of informed consent that we generally want or look for from participants. Those folks who can't give consent are people like prisoners or children or the developmentally disabled or elderly who are impaired cognitively. These are folks who we judge not fully capable of giving informed consent. So if we conduct research with them or if we conduct testing with them, we have to be especially careful about how we go about explaining the research or the testing will involve, and how we assess their level of ability to agree or not agree to participation. The second principle from the Belmont Report is beneficence, and here again we have two main provisions. The first provision is that we want to protect participants from harm, and this seems fairly obvious, but it's important. Beneficence means doing good or doing right by people. And in order to protect participants from harm, we need to identify potential risks in research and again also in testing. This is important. We have to think, what are the sources of distress or discomfort or anxiety or worry that could come up if someone undergoes testing for us. We also, kind of relatedly, want to try our best to ensure participant well-being, and that can involve identifying potential rewards or benefits from participation in testing or in research. And again, I kind of hinted at this before, but it's worthy of its own highlighting. This principle of beneficence may be especially challenging for psychology, both for psychological research and also for psychological testing and assessment, because most of the constructs that we study are abstract and difficult to directly observe. So things like psychological distress, or things like increased knowledge of self, or increased self-esteem, costs or risks and benefits or rewards. These things are not impossible to assess, but they're tricky in this field of work, maybe as compared to other areas of science or clinical practice. Now, the third principle in the Belmont Report is justice, and as I see it, there's really one main provision here, and that is a provision that we find a fair balance, such that the people who bear the greatest costs or risks associated with research or indeed with testing also garner the greatest benefits or rewards associated with the results of that research or in that testing. We can think historically of the Tuskegee study as an example of great injustice, because the folks who bore the greatest risk in that study got the least benefit or reward from participation. And it's a good example, but we can also apply this principle to other research that is more contemporary, perhaps less controversial, and again we can apply this research, or this principle, to the idea of testing. Is the person who's going to undergo the greatest cost in this testing, the participant or the client who will have to spend time, maybe spend money, maybe be exposed to distress from answering challenging or difficult questions, is that person going to get the benefit, or is the benefit going to come mostly to me, the clinician, who might want to earn a bit of extra money or satisfy my curiosity, or so on? So this table here gives a quick review of the principles in the Belmont Report and gives some applications that I think are some of them I've mentioned, some of them may be a bit obvious, but it's worth spending a few minutes here and reading through this information, making sure you understand the basic shape or the features of the Belmont Report's principles. The important point, or the important idea here, is that, at least I'm trying to make in this lecture, is that Belmont Report focuses on research and the ethics around research, but these principles and these provisions that come from these principles can apply to testing as well. In fact, I think they should apply to testing as well. So we can think of respect for test takers. People are autonomous agents. They should be given informed consent for testing. We shouldn't coerce people into undergoing testing that they might not want to undergo. Some people deserve a special protection because they can't give informed consent to undergo testing. In those cases, qualified guardians must be present and we must work with them in order to get their consent for testing, and we must also assess the assent, that is the general agreement that the test taker has. So principle of respect applies to research, it also applies to testing. the principle of beneficence towards test takers. Testing should not harm. At least we should make every effort to minimize the harms associated with testing by identifying potential risks or challenging parts of testing. Is it going to be fatiguing? Is it going to be anxiety provoking? Is it going to be upsetting to do this testing? And what, if anything, can we do to minimize those risks or discomforts? And we should identify the potential rewards of testing. How is this testing going to help? Is there a sufficient preponderance of help as compared to harm in this testing, administering this particular test or this battery of tests to this particular client? We can take the Belmont Report's principle of justice and we can apply it to testing as well. Again, there should be this fair balance. The test taker, of course, bears a lot of cost in terms of testing. The time it takes to do the test, the money that he or she might have to pay for it, the distress that might arise. This should be balanced with the benefits to him or her, not the benefits to the test administrator or the test giver, the clinician. We can get benefits from testing, again, in terms of charging a fee or satisfying our curiosity or just maybe dwelling upon our interest in a particular construct or so on. But the balance in terms of justice between costs and benefits really has to reside within the test taker himself or herself. So again, an important point here that I'm sort of returning to again and again, hopefully it's making sense to you as you listen to me, is that the Belmont Report is a foundational document for ethical guidelines in science that includes psychology, and for our purposes especially can include psychological testing. If you think about and you kind of try to understand the principles of the Belmont Report, I think they'll stand you well as you negotiate ethical challenges in a variety of different areas of your practice, whether it's your research, whether it's your clinical practice of psychotherapy, whether it's your clinical practice of testing. This is important stuff, so please take some time to think about it and learn it. Okay, in the next section of this lecture, I want to talk specifically about some of the guidelines for psychologists, some of the ethical guidelines for psychologists. And here I'm just using the American Psychological Association's Code of Conduct. You're probably familiar with this document already. If you've taken a research methods class, you might have encountered this before, or some of your other psychology classes. But if you're not, you can easily go to the APA's website, and right on the front page you should be able to find a link for ethics. This is just obviously a screenshot from the last time I went to the page, but it's not much changed, I'm sure, if you go there right now. And what you'll find on the APA's ethics section of their website are general ethical standards, 5 of them to be precise, that guide individual aspects of ethical behavior, and as you'll see, overlap largely with the principles in the Belmont Report. So the principles the APA promotes overlap with, or are really frankly built upon, the principles of the Belmont Report. Now, I said there are 5 general ethical principles. Beneficence as a principle gets some additional details involving things like the principle of integrity, striving for accuracy and truth, fidelity, and the maintenance of trust. And respect for persons as a principle gets slightly renamed to respect for people's rights and dignity, but is otherwise basically the same thing. And so just as you can see, and as I've tried to kind of explain already, we have the 3 basic principles from the Belmont Report, which you can see on the furthest left, and then slightly to the right of that you can see the 5 ethical principles from the APA. This is the 2002 version, but they're not changed in more recent versions. And you can see that basically beneficence is expanded somewhat or kind of embellished somewhat. Justice is more or less the same, and respect for persons is slightly renamed. But it's basically the same idea. Now, the important point is that these general ethical principles are ideals that all psychologists should aspire to, and they support specific standards of conduct, which we'll get to in just the next slide and the many slides that follow it. So as I said before, with respect to the Belmont principles, I think it's important to learn and to memorize and to really try to understand and internalize these principles from the APA. I think if you can remember them, it makes learning the finer points of the ethical standards easier, and it makes them easier to remember. And if you encounter an ethical problem in your research, in your clinical practice, or wherever, it's easy and it's valuable to remember these principles. And if you do, they'll guide you very well, because that's of course what they're for. So now let's get a little bit into the specific ethical standards that the APA promotes. Now there are 10 of them in total. I'm really going to focus mostly on Ethical Standard 9, which applies to assessment, but I'll also touch a little bit on Ethical Standard 3, which involves human relations, and a little bit about Ethical Standard 4, which is privacy and confidentiality. Now each of these standards itself has many subparts, as you'll see in just a few more slides. So it is frankly difficult to memorize all of them. At least it's difficult for me. It's probably difficult for you as well. I do think for the purpose of this class, it's important to learn well the standards under Ethical Standard 9, the points under Ethical Standard 9 that apply to assessment. It is important. It's probably a bit tedious to learn this stuff, but it's important. What's really, really important, as I've said in previous slides though, is to get a sense of the general ethical principles for the APA and indeed from the Belmont Report, because that's the most important stuff to remember. Like if you don't remember anything else, remember that stuff. But really you should try to remember some of the stuff I'll cover in the next few slides that's specific to Ethical Standard number 9. Okay, so the first part of Ethical Standard 9 is 9.01, which is just called the Bases for Assessment. Idea here is that if we're making a report or we're giving testimony in a court, or we're providing or interacting with the media or the public, the information that we give them about a particular subject or particular participant, a particular client, should be based on sufficient information from testing in order to be substantiated. Put more simply, we shouldn't just opine or speculate carelessly if we describe a particular, if we write a report about a particular client, or if we give testimony about a particular client, or if we're describing someone's a particular case to the public. We need to base what we're saying on actual data, and that data can come from interviews and from observations and from tests. And we have to be honest about the information we have. What am I basing my opinion on? What am I basing my clinical judgment on? We also have to be honest about the information that we don't have. If you are asked to write a report on a client that you have not interviewed, and let's say it's a diagnostic report, you have to be honest about the fact that you haven't interviewed that person directly. Maybe you're forming your opinions based on secondary data sources. That's not necessarily a bad thing, but you have to both acknowledge the data you have. I'm looking at a previous report by another psychologist, or I have access to this person's medical records, or so on and so on. But you also have to be honest about the information you don't have. Like, I have not sat down with this client to conduct a formal interview, and so on. So I guess I've said this already, but the ideal situation is that we would conduct an individual examination of each person that we're trying to form an opinion about. So if I'm going to write a report on a particular client, or give testimony on a particular client, or whatever, the ideal would be that I've had time and the resources to sit down and examine that person individually, perhaps conducting an interview, administering some tests, perhaps administering some tests to friends and family members, and so on. There may be some situations in which this ideal is not possible, or maybe even not necessary. If we're conducting supervision, like if as a licensed professional we're supervising trainees, or if we're working as a consultant, or if we've been called in to review a record, like you brought in to review someone's medical records or psychological records, it's not necessary always that we go back and interview the person, the client in particular. But again, we need to be honest, and we need to acknowledge the limited nature of the information we have. So if years from now you're licensed and you're conducting supervision of trainees, you can give opinions to your trainees about their clients. That's the job of supervision. But you have to be fairly circumspect in those opinions, acknowledging the limited information that you have about those particular clients. So the next part of Ethical Standard 9 is 9.02, and this is just called Use of Assessments. And this is kind of straightforward. It says that basically we should be careful to choose when we choose our tests and assessments. We should select tests based on evidence of their usefulness, based on their established reliability and validity, and also based on their appropriateness for given the language skills and native language of our test taker. So as a general idea here, you shouldn't just haphazardly pick the tests that you're going to administer to a client just because they're the ones you have on your shelf, or they're the ones that your clinic purchases from publishers, or they're the ones that you personally like because that's what you were trained on when you were in graduate school. You should think a little bit about the tests that you're selecting and ask yourself, is there evidence that this test is going to be useful? Granted, useful is a little bit of a vague term for this particular client. That's where you might want to hearken back to a principle of beneficence and justice. You should also think, do I know enough about the reliability and validity of this instrument to judge that it's appropriate for my client or in this situation? And is it in a language that he or she is going to easily understand? That's important. Don't haphazardly pick your tests. Should be fairly obvious, but if it's not, here's a ethical standard 9.02 that argues that it should be. Ethical Standard 9.03 is called Informed Consent for Testing, and this one's pretty straightforward. It's just get informed consent. This flows fairly directly from the general ethical principle of respect for persons, or respect for persons and their dignity, the idea that people are autonomous agents who have the right to make informed decisions about what they do and don't participate in. There are some exceptions that this principle, this standard acknowledges, like there may be cases in which testing is mandated by law, or in which testing is part of a routine educational or institutional activity, like for instance, standardized testing at a school or screening when someone enters a hospital or prison. And there may be in situations in which we do testing to evaluate someone's capacity to engage in consent for more testing. So it's not that every single time we administer any sort of test we have to go through a lengthy informed consent process, but generally speaking we should. Accepting these particular cases, we should give people who are undergoing testing sufficient information about the nature of the testing, the purpose of the testing, the potential risks, the potential benefits, so that that person can decide in an informed and autonomous way whether or not to agree and participate in the testing. So as I said on the previous slide, informed consent involves giving people information on the nature and the purpose of testing, including the costs associated with it. It involves giving people information about the involvement of third parties. Will this testing involve contacting your employer or contacting your spouse to ask him or her questions? It also involves providing information about the limits of confidentiality. If you think back to the previous lecture, I talked a little bit about situations in which confidentiality is maintained and situations in which it is broken because of potential harm to the client or to others. Importantly, informed consent involves an opportunity to ask and answer questions. Informed consent, I think we sometimes imagine is this one stop where we give someone a sheet of paper with some information and they sign at the bottom and that's it, we've got informed consent. Really, it's a process. It's a process that should involve some back and forth, some asking and answering of questions between you and the client or you and the research participant. It's an ongoing thing that can occur within a time period rather than a strict moment when someone says, aha, now I've signed away my consent. The APA standard 9.03 is also very specific about language, that we should avoid using jargon, We should speak in language that the test taker can easily understand, and we should be considerate of culture and background and knowledge that the person brings to the conversation so that we don't accidentally mislead them. We probe for their understanding, making sure they get what we're saying, and they have, as noted above, opportunities to ask questions and get answers. And of course, if necessary, we use an interpreter. So if we're doing testing with someone who is not a native English speaker or doesn't have good language skills, we may need to use an interpreter. And if so, that's absolutely essential to get informed consent. Standard 9.04 is release of test data, and to summarize this point, I would just say it involves being really careful about how we release test data. So we have to be careful about test data. By that I mean records, notes, answers for questions, videotape, audio recordings, etc., etc. Anything that involves identifying information, items, specific responses, scores, can only be released if the test taker gives a signed consent for that to be released. So if you've ever undergone, for instance, medical testing, which you probably have at one point in your life or another, you were probably prompted by your doctor or by your nurse to sign a consent that this information could be released to your insurance company, or could be released to the billing department of the hospital where the testing was done. That idea of being very circumspect and careful about releasing test data is important for medical testing. It's certainly important for psychological testing as well, especially given the tendency that we can have to misunderstand or overly reify psychological constructs, a point I've made amply in previous lectures. We have to be really careful about releasing test data, especially if it could cause harm to the client, if it could be misused or misunderstood or misrepresented. We also have to be careful about releasing test data if it could damage the integrity of the test. And this actually ties into ethical standard 9.11, which essentially involves maintaining test security. If I give someone a copy of the test items that they completed, that might not seem like that big a deal. It might seem a lot like if you take an academic test and your teacher grades it and gives you your copy of the test to take home and keep if you want. It may not seem like that big a deal, but in the world of psychological testing, that could be a huge problem. In fact, it almost always is. We don't want copies of tests floating around in the public, people uploading scanned images of items from their Wechsler Adult Intelligence Scale or their Minnesota Multiphasic Personality Inventory onto the internet. If people do that, and there certainly are people who do, it makes it easy for other people to find that information and then use it to fake the test or to mislead the test taker when they themselves undergo testing, or it may just contribute to a general misunderstanding about the nature and the purposes of psychological testing. So for all sorts of reasons, we have to be really careful about releasing test data. Reasons that have to do both with the kind of the safety and the minimizing of harm to the particular client, and also to the integrity of the testing process itself. Ethical Standard 9.05 involves test construction, and this applies mostly to people who develop tests. If you are a professional psychometrist, if you're working for a test development company, but it also applies if you are an individual researcher, maybe who's coming up with a new questionnaire that you're using in your laboratory that you might want to publish in a paper or a book chapter. And the idea is that you have to use good psychometric procedures when developing a test. You have to be careful how you design the test, how you select the items or come up with the problems or pictographic stimuli or whatever it is for your test. You have to go through a standardization process where you gather norms about the performance of people in the population of interest on those test items. You have to go through a process of validating the test by determining whether or not the test is related to outcomes or other psychological constructs that it should be based on your theory of the test and the construct that it evaluates. You have to go through procedures to reduce potential bias, and then you have to publish all this information in a technical manual. So I know I've talked about this before, but it's worth repeating. this stuff is important, and indeed that's part of why when I developed this class, I included, as you'll see in future lectures, a fair number of lectures and a fair bit of time in class to instructing you or training you on basic psychometrics. Sometimes when I've described this class to other professionals, they've asked, why do you include all this information on reliability and validity and classical test theory and all that other stuff? And my feeling is, well, this stuff is interesting to know. It's important to know if you ever want to develop your own tests, which some people will do, either for professional work or for their research and their academic work. It's also part of our ethical standards from the APA under Ethical Standard 9.05. Ethical Standard 9.06 is interpreting assessment results. This is just kind of almost a catch-all that says when you interpret results, you don't just take them in isolation. You don't just say, well, the person scored this score on my one test, therefore that means they have this level of a particular trait or this level of a particular ability. You try to integrate the data from your test with your understanding of other variables or other factors, like the purpose of the assessment, the person's ability to answer the questions on the day that you tested them, the nature of the situation or the context in which the testing took place, important personal factors like linguistic or cultural background, which could have influenced someone's performance. To summarize, I would say you have to put the results, meaning the score that the person earned on a particular test, in a context, and that context should involve the whole person as best as you can understand him or her at the time that they were doing the test. Do you have reason to believe that this test is an accurate representation of that person's abilities or traits or whatever else, or do you have reason to be cautious in making that judgment because of situations that came up or personal factors that may have in some way impacted or influenced or interfered with performance? Ethical Standard 9.07 is called Assessment by Unqualified Persons, and the standard holds that we basically, as psychologists, as professionals, shouldn't promote the use of tests by people who are unqualified. So as you can see from this image here, I'm again, as I did in my last lecture, kind of making fun a little bit of the proliferation of online psychological testing of dubious quality. We as professionals shouldn't promote this practice. We shouldn't encourage or set up our own websites to offer free personality testing or free mindfulness testing or whatever else. We should also in our own clinical practice be very hesitant to have other people do the testing for us. Sometimes in busy clinical settings, it may be very tempting to hire someone to administer tests and then have you as the psychologist merely interpret the results. There are trained professionals who do this. However, who are called psychometrists, by the way, but we need to be very careful about providing the appropriate level of training and instruction for anyone who's going to administer tests other than ourselves. And ideally, we should be the ones administering the tests and interpreting the results. We shouldn't be encouraging other people who may not have the qualifications to do the testing for us. Ethical Standard 9.08 is refers to or covers obsolete or outdated tests and is a simple one. It's just don't use them. Don't use technology that's out of date for all sorts of reasons that I've highlighted in previous lectures. At the very least, the performance of those items on that test may be different today than it was a decade ago when the test was first developed. The norms that we might use to interpret the test today are maybe not the same as the norms that were in existence at the time the test was developed, and so on. We have to be careful about that stuff, and ideally or usually just avoid the use of old testing technologies. Ethical Standard 9.09 refers to test scoring and interpretation services. And these are services which exist to help clinicians score and interpret the results of testing. In some cases, there are conveniences. If there's a test that you don't have the time to interpret, you might be able to find a company that will do the interpretation for you. There are other tests which you pretty much have to use scoring and interpretation services for. So for instance, the Minnesota Multiphasic Personality Inventory would be very difficult to score and interpret entirely by hand, although you could technically do it. So most people who use that test will transmit the responses that their test participant or client makes to the scoring service run by the test publisher, and that scoring service will return a kind of a printout or a text file with a report that then the clinician can use to can extract information from and use when he or she writes an assessment for that particular client. And so under this principle, if you run one of these services, if you as your business do test interpretation, you have to make sure that you provide to the clinicians who are your customers sufficient information about how you're doing the scoring and interpretation, the norms that you're using, the standardization processes that you're referring to, the reliability and validity of your scoring algorithms or your scoring techniques, and so on. What's probably more common is if you're a clinician who's using one of these services, you have to select one based on its competence. You can't just select a service that's really cheap, or that's that you like the website for, or that's run by a friend of yours. You have to select one where the staff are trained appropriately, where they publish sufficient information for you to make an informed decision about the quality of their scoring, and so on. And in the case of, say, the MMPI, it's pretty straightforward because the company that makes the test also does the scoring. So they are arguably the best authority on how that test should be scored and interpreted. Nevertheless, you need to, as a clinician, spend some time understanding what you're paying for. You can't just say, well, they're a professional service, I'm going to use them, and that's all I need to think about. And relatedly, even if you use a professional scoring service, you as the clinician are still responsible for the final product. That is to say, the final assessment that you write up and that you give to the client, or that you communicate to whoever you're working with, that's on you. You can't say, well, the scoring service said this, therefore it's their fault if it's right, or it's their fault if it's wrong. It's on you. You have to be responsible. So just to kind of illustrate what we're talking about here, this is a sample page from a report done by the Minnesota Multiphasic Personality Inventory scoring system. And how this might work is, you could imagine as a clinician administering the test to a client. She returns, or he, I guess in this case, returns all his answers to you, fills out the questionnaire. You transmit that information to the company, and they send back to you a computer-generated report that has some information about, you can see on this page here, interpersonal relations and diagnostic considerations and so on. You don't just immediately turn around and give that report to the client or to whoever's whoever has requested the assessment. You rather read through that information, put it in context with the other tests and assessments, other tests and interviews that you've done before, and integrate it into a report. You, again, as the clinician, are responsible for developing the final product, not the scoring service. So I've already talked about this before, but Ethical Standard 9.10 involves explaining assessment results, meaning explaining results to your test taker. You have to do this unless you've arranged not to in advance. So there may be situations in which an assessment's conducted where there's an agreed, it is agreed in advance that the person won't get feedback on their test. This sometimes happens in routine testing in educational settings, for instance, or organizational settings. There's not an expectation that the test taker gets individual feedback, but in most cases there's an expectation that you give someone feedback about their test, how they did on the test, and what your assessment is as a result of their performance. As I've discussed before, it's really important that we make sure that this feedback, it takes place in the form of a conversation that is appropriate to the understanding and the language skills and the background of the person taking the test, that minimizes the use of jargon or confusing constructs or technical terms and so on. I already mentioned Ethical Standard 9.11 before, but I'll hit it again. This is maintaining test security, which just advises us not to release sensitive information about a test out into the public. So test materials, test manuals, copies of items, scanned images, photocopies, etc., uninterpreted test scores. We don't hand these out to our test takers. We don't send it home with them. We don't let our friends or our spouse, who's assuming that person's a non-psychologist, borrow the technical manual for a test or read about it because it's interesting. We don't blog about this if we're into blogging, because we want to be very careful about creating misinformation in the public, especially online, about the nature and the purpose of testing. We have to be careful with this stuff, because if a lot of information gets out about the MMPI or the WACE or the MCMI or any of these other tests, the validity of these instruments can be severely challenged, and they'll no longer be useful for clinicians and test takers. So to round this all out, the important idea here is that there are these 10 specific ethical standards that the APA promotes that flow from their 5 basic ethical principles. I've just focused on one of the 10, that is the one that corresponds mostly to assessment. And I do think it's important to try and understand these, to memorize them if possible, because they're really important, especially as you get out into clinical practice with tests. You need to keep these in mind. But again, try to see them as flowing from those basic principles. That's kind of the foundation, and the standards are built upon or flow from them. And the specific standards for testing are even more, kind of flow even more from those general principles. Okay, so it's been a fairly long lecture. Thanks for sticking with me. Preview for next time, we're going to talk a little bit about the history of testing and how tests have changed over time. I think if you pay attention in that lecture, which hopefully you'll be doing anyway, but if you pay attention in that lecture, you'll see examples historically of the way that psychological testing was done in an unethical fashion, and maybe that will help you to kind of consolidate what you've learned in this lecture and in the previous lecture. And as I always say at this point, thank you so much for your attention. That's all for this lecture. If you have any questions, talk to me in class, post questions on Blackboard. If you're just watching this video on YouTube, post a question or a comment in the comment section. I'll do my best to respond to them. If you have a little bit of time, make yourself a cup of tea, a cup of coffee, sit down and think about what you've learned. Hopefully it will stick. But again, if not, let me know. Thanks so much. See you next time. Bye-bye.